Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jason Bauer-Clapp. I'm a career advisor and the associate director at Smith College's Lazarus Center for Career Development. And I'm really just so pleased and excited that you're all joining us today for this introduction to fundraising and grant writing. We are recording today's session, and our goal is to post it on the Lazarus Center's YouTube page within the next week or so. If you haven't yet visited our YouTube, please do check it out. There are how-to videos and recordings of presentations on a variety of career planning, interviewing, networking, internship, and job search topics, and we're regularly adding new video content there. So for the presentation today, I think just to keep things simple for audio and connections, we'll request that you keep yourselves muted during the session, and we can really rely on the chat for asking questions. And I'll be monitoring the chat and can share questions with Aimee as they come up. And for those of you who are viewing using video for this, and if you're less familiar with Zoom, probably use the speaker view rather than the gallery view, just so you can have a kind of a clear picture of our presenter. With that, our presenter, Aimee Walker, graduated from Smith College in 1999 as an English language and literature major, and later completed an MFA at Columbia. Aimee is a development consultant based in New York City with over 17 years of experience in the fundraising field, including 10 years at Race Forward, a national organization focused on racial justice. And Aimee, truly, we're just so grateful that you're sharing your time and your expertise with Smithies during this session. So a huge thank you to you in advance. And with that, I'm gonna hand off to you.
Great, thank you so much. And I definitely wanted to thank you and the Lazarus Center for making this possible. I know this is a challenging time for many of us in many different ways. And some people have said we're all in the same storm, but in different boats. But I really do feel like this is a very important time to have this conversation around fundraising, because nonprofits really need all of you, I think, more than ever. And I think whatever your interest or cause is, likely the organizations working in that area are having some struggles right now too, and really need people with your skills to help. And that's everything from racial and social justice organizations to food banks that I think are going to need all of you. I know some of you are recent graduates and maybe looking immediately into the field. Others are, I think, still in school, but I don't think we're going to be out of this time anytime soon. So I'm hopeful that this is going to be useful. I saw in the chat that some of you have had a lot of experience and some have had very little experience in fundraising. This is going to be very much what I think of as kind of a 101 class. I do have my email address, in the information I shared with you. So definitely, if you have more advanced questions, feel free to let me know. And also throughout this whole time that I'm talking, I'm going to be talking at you for a little while, but feel free to ask questions, chat in questions. I will have time at the end, but I also told Jason, feel free to interrupt me if there's a burning question that it would be good for me to answer in the middle of this. And I also wanted to start out saying that, as I said, I think you have the skills in some ways that you need to jump right into fundraising. And I think that everything from being able to research well, you need to be able to research both the funders and what their interests are, but also the subject area that you're working in. You need to be able to listen well and deeply to what funders want, to what is needed in your field, to what your program staff, if you're working with an organization that has program staff, needs and wants, and what they think the program value is. And you need to be able to write well. And I believe that having been at Smith many years ago, but I have faith that those are all things that you have learned and are learning while you're there. So I think it's a good fit. And I really do also think that you know, the world really needs your willingness to fight for your ideas right now. So I'm hoping that this is helpful to have some tools to do that work. We're not going to be able to cover every aspect of fundraising for sure, but I do hope to introduce some ideas and, as I said, to answer your questions for sure. So I'm going to start. You could pull out the article that I sent around. That would be great. The 10 most important things you can know about fundraising. This is by Kim Klein, who's a pretty well-known fundraiser in the social justice arena. And some of what she says and what I think is very true is that nonprofit, of course, doesn't mean no money is involved, and you need money to advance any mission that you have. And in order to do that fundraising work, you need to have the right mindset because, as Kim Klein says and other people say, people won't give unless you ask them. There have been lots of studies on why people donate to charities, and pretty overwhelmingly, the answer is because I was asked. So it's very important to ask, and you have to feel comfortable making that ask. So that's a big piece of it, because fundraising can be challenging in that particular way. We all have culturally ingrained ideas about money. This is something that's covered a lot in the article. Some cultures view it in, you know, different ways, but a lot of us come from cultures where there's anxiety around talking about money. And so it's important to think that through and to be comfortable with where you're coming from before you do any kind of asking. I really do think that the only way that we're going to be able to pay people to do the challenging and very necessary work that nonprofits take on in this country is through fundraising. And it's not just about asking for money. It's also about really effectively connecting people who already are predisposed to want to help the cause that you're working toward, helping to connect them with the means to do that. So I try, you know, it's not always possible, but I try to always come to fundraising with that attitude that I'm providing an opportunity for others to help in a way that they wouldn't be able to if I didn't offer that connection. Hopefully that's a helpful way to think about it. There's a lot more in the article that I think is helpful. If you take a look at number 8, there's a quote that Kim Klein provides from another fundraiser that says, if you're doing good work, then you have a right to raise money to do it. What you must do is figure out how to articulate what you're doing so the person hearing it, if they share your values, will want to exchange their money for your work. They will pay you to do work they cannot do alone. And I think that's another really good way to think about it, and to maybe figure out how to get into the mindset that you would need to fundraise. And I'll also say that that's true of all forms of fundraising. As sort of build for this webinar, I'm going to focus a little more on grant writing. And in some cases, people think that grant writing might be a little easier than other forms of fundraising because you're writing off to someone who may be anonymous to you, or you may feel anonymous to them. Doesn't feel as difficult as asking in person, but I'll say that in general, most nonprofits can't survive by grant writing alone. And also, even if they could, or even if you're with an organization that has that sort of relatively rare situation, I think even when you're writing, even if you're writing government grants, I think coming at the work with this mindset that it's not about just asking someone to give to you, that it's about offering them an opportunity. I think that's useful, even in the written work. I would also just note from the article that she points out that most money donated to charities comes from individuals rather than institutional funders like foundations and corporations. It's very common for a new fundraiser to come into an organization and there's an expectation that you're going to just be able to write these grant proposals and all this money is going to flow in. But the truth is the vast majority of dollars actually come from individuals, and that's sometimes a tougher road, but it is definitely an important one. Right now, this article that I shared is a little bit old, but even the most recent data from 2018 says that about 68% of charitable donations came from individuals. So that is, you know, continues to be true. The lines get blurred a little nowadays where you have things like donor advised funds. If people have specific questions about those, happy to answer them. But the reality is that there is a person behind most of the dollars that are given to charities, a person or people behind those gifts nowadays. So I was going to go into just fairly briefly some of the forms of fundraising other than grant writing, just to touch on those. Hopefully that's useful to go through, as I said, fairly fast. I did share in the handout some more resources. So hopefully as I go through this relatively quickly, people can also find additional resources where there's more detail on all of these things. So there are lots of ways to raise money. Some of the sort of top forms of fundraising, I guess, in-person solicitations. So meeting with a donor or donors to actually ask them for money. At some organizations, this isn't something that the fundraiser would necessarily do, but would help to facilitate the executive director or the board members to do. But it very much varies by organization how this goes. And at some institutions, you could be asking for a $50 gift. At others, you could be asking for $500,000. My quick tip, top line tip on in-person solicitations is just to practice. Literally sit in front of the mirror or with a friend or whatever situation works for you and say, can you donate $5,000 so that our program can buy a new van? Those are very difficult words to say for many people. You get tripped up. So I definitely recommend practice when it comes to in-person solicitations. Another form of fundraising that you'll hear a lot about if you do wind up working for a nonprofit organization is the annual appeal. And really all that means is that you're getting your donors who gave last year to give you money this year. Happens in different forms at different organizations. Sometimes it's a membership, you know, at a museum where there's going to be, you know, you signed up for your membership in September, you're going to get a letter again in September. Sometimes organizations will just ask everyone toward the end of the year. It depends on the type of organization and what they do. And I think that my hot tip here is just make sure that you're not just sending an ask to these folks that give to you year after year, that you're also sending them some information on the latest work your organization has been doing, other pieces of information throughout the year, so that it's not just that once a year letter that they hear from you. Special appeals, another form of fundraising. This, in my mind, is anything that is timely or subject matter based. So subject matter based meaning you have a new program you want to share or new project. You know, using the example I said before about needing a new van, you know, something like that, where it's time bound and sort of a specific need. And I think that the key here is just to take advantage of this kind of specific appeal in a way that feels authentic and conveys the urgency. And then the other sort of big bucket of fundraising is events, things like galas, but I would say the key is to have an event that fits your audience. So it may not be a gala. It may be like a small house party, something like that. It really depends on your audience. If you have people that can, pay $500 for a dinner, great, that's more of a gala. If that's not your audience, you need to do something different and something that feels appropriate to that community. So there's an organization here in New York called Fierce that serves queer youth, and they do a bowl-a-thon every year. Not this year, no one's doing events this year, but most years that's something that happens, and it works for them, works for the community that that they're working, that is most interested in helping the constituents that they serve. So it can be a lot of different things. And the other thing I'll just say quickly is events are not easy. If you're a new fundraiser, hopefully, or new to the field, hopefully this isn't necessarily where you have to start, because, or if it is where you have to start, hopefully there's an established event that you're coming into. It's important to be clear that, like, if you are doing an event for the first year, statistics show that you're not actually going to make money the first year, that you're going to make money in subsequent years as you build the event, as you build following. So it's good to just keep that in mind and set expectations, especially if you're newer to this work. And I'll just say that all of these forms of fundraising, including grant writing, as we'll talk about a little bit more, research and writing is involved. You need to know who you're meeting with or who's coming to your event, who you're asking for money, what they can give, and where their interests lie. Sometimes you also need to have something in writing to share, whether that's a one sheet on the organization or a full proposal. So again, skills that you already have are going to come into play, and I think put you a little bit ahead of the game. And obviously knowing how to research will also help you understand who the audience is that you're presenting the work to. So your writing is going to change based on that. Again, there's more resources in the handout, so hopefully that answers some of your questions, but definitely also feel free to chat in questions now if any of that was unclear, or if there's anything you'd like me to go into a little more detail on. I'm gonna jump to grant writing specifically for a little bit, and then see if there's anything I can answer. So if you take a look at the section in the handout that talks about foundation, corporate, and government grant solicitation process, it might be kind of useful to reference as we go along. Grants are really just formal written requests for funding that you'll send to foundations, corporations, and government entities. And depending on who you're sending grant proposals to, they can vary quite a bit in terms of what you'll want to present. And I would say even within, say, the category of foundation grants, there are lots of differences in the types of grant makers and what they'll want to see. So before you do anything, you're researching the funder themselves, what they are interested in seeing in terms of proposals, and what you've seen them respond to before, what other organizations they've given to. That's really the first step. In some cases, there may be an interest in hearing more of a narrative, more of a story. In general, I'll say, foundations, family foundations especially, are going to want to hear something that's more of a story. Whereas in a government grant, you're not going to have space for that. So starting to become aware of those differences, even before you write your first grant proposal, can be useful. If you can get your hands on some sample grant proposals that have been written either for whatever organization you've worked for or you're working for, or just through friends and networks, it's useful to sort of see some samples. Also, some of the books that I shared in the further reading section, you know, they do have some sample grant proposals. So it's kind of useful to know what, just even how to write, what the style is for some of these different kinds of grants. But I'll try to just say what I think you'll need for most proposals, the kinds of things that I think you want to keep in mind. And using kind of the example of, it's not that different from papers that I remember vaguely writing for, you know, the Psych 101 class that I took when my first year at Smith. So hopefully it's not totally unfamiliar. You'll need to do research to get statistics, and you'll need to follow directions. So I think there's kind of a couple of different ways in which I specifically see this playing out. In terms of understanding the directions, you need to know both what they want and exactly how they describe the guidelines. So for example, having the wrong font size can be a problem. Not having the right attachments. Attachments can be anything from budgets to board lists. There is actually in the materials to have on hand section in the handout, there's a list that is basically the different kinds of attachments that you might need to share with a funder. These are just as important as the proposal itself. And just to give an example from my own life, when I was very early in my fundraising career, I sent the wrong attachments, or I failed to send one attachment that was required by the funder. And the organization that I was working for had been getting a grant from this funder every year for the past few years. They were expecting the grant. I sent this in incorrectly. We didn't get $10,000. They just said, you know, we're throwing this proposal out because it's incomplete. So that's a lesson that I learned the hard way. Luckily, they had a second deadline later in the year. We were able to apply. We did get the money. It was, you know, delayed, but not a total loss for the organization. But it definitely taught me my lesson that you know, you have to check and double check, and that all these little things from, you know, as I said, font size to attachments, they're all so important. And the details really unfortunately matter, because these funders are getting proposals from, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of potential grantees, and they are sometimes looking for a quick way to weed you out. So it's just important to be really, really careful. In terms of the research piece of this, what I mean by, you know, sort of your experience in research can be useful is that you're going to want to look at statistics on the problem that your project, organization, or program is trying to solve. And that's something you're going to need to share with the funder. Sometimes you're asking for money from a funder who's very familiar with your field, but more often than not, you are really giving them new information and doing, you know, funder education even as you're asking them for money. So you're going to have to tell them why your work is important. So it is sort of research similar to a research paper that you've done for school. You're really looking at those statistics. You're also looking at your organization's own evaluation information in many cases. Have you, as an organization serving people who are food insecure, have you seen a spike in need? Can you show that with your data? That's something that is very important for a grant proposal. So again, research is important. Another skill that I think I remember, again, somewhat from Smith, is learning how to collaborate. So most of the time, you as a fundraiser are not necessarily implementing the program or project that you're talking about and writing about. So you're going to need to collaborate with the frontline program staff to get the information you need. and to tell a compelling story to the funders. So I always think of it as a little bit of translation. The people who are closest to a program often see every aspect of it as important. And it probably is, but it's not, every aspect is not important enough to capture the funder's attention, unfortunately. So you have to serve in that role of assessing what really would be the most important piece of this work to talk about and to highlight, not to leave things out that are essential, but to make sure that you're being concise and clear, and again, telling a compelling story to the funder. And I think that you can also use what you know from literature you've read in school, from any writing classes you may have taken, to do a certain amount of storytelling when it comes to actually writing the proposal. I think you obviously have to answer exactly the questions that the funder asks. So sometimes this is a little tricky. I mean, I would say that is the most important thing, but as you're answering those questions, you also want to make sure that you're being very clear about this sort of story of your work. What is the need? How does your program solve that need? And how can the world basically be better with the money that this funder is going to give you? So if you can make that clear, even as you're answering their questions, I think your proposal will stand out from others that they're going to get. And then, how you write is also important. And obviously, you've learned at Smith a lot about good writing. Readability is key. It's not about, beautiful language, unfortunately, as much as some of us might be drawn to that. As Jason mentioned, I have studied writing. I have an MFA. I would love to be writing something that's a little more beautiful than what I wind up writing for grant proposals. But really what I've realized is that clarity is the most important thing. People are reading whatever I put in front of them as a fundraiser very quickly. And I just need to be very clear and as concise as possible. And so that's really the writing skill that you're looking for, is that ability to be clear and concise. So that was very brief and a lot of me talking. So I don't know if there are any specific questions that people had they want to share. Happy to try to answer those. I'd also happy to go into a little more detail about grant writing if there aren't any questions.
You can take just a moment. I don't see any questions in the chat right now, Aimee. You can probably see that too.
Yeah, I see that there aren't any. So I don't know if anybody wants to ask as I keep going, feel free. Again, if you have specific questions that you'd rather just email me, that's fine too. But here to answer whatever would be of most interest to you. And meanwhile, I can start kind of just going through the basics of a grant proposal, like the sort of basic outline. And feel free to stop me if there's anything that would be of more interest, for sure. So the basic outline of a grant proposal is under number 5 in the handout about grant proposals specifically. So if you're gonna draft a proposal, there's sort of, I've listed out here are the areas that you'll generally need to cover. The intro, which should be very brief. I like to say, like, imagine this is a paper about a subject that you care about, but others may not understand. So you have a few paragraphs or a few sentences to capture your reader and give them the highlights very quickly. Why do you think that any particular foundation would be interested in the work? And often in this particular situation, I would go back to the guidelines that the funder themselves presented and literally echo back what they've said. If they say, we are interested in helping make sure that there are no food insecure individuals in our immediate area, or something along those lines. They usually phrase it a little bit more elegantly than I just did. I would literally echo back those words to them. That is what you are doing with your program. You know, and making sure that it's clear exactly what their dollars would be going to. You'll need to show why the issue you're working with is a problem. And as I said, in some cases, they won't know. In the program description, you know, that's, again, program staff will have a certain way of talking about it. And you need to figure out how to present the most important pieces. One way I think of about this is to sort of imagine that I'm a journalist and interview program staff that way, you know, asking for the kind of who, what, when, where, why. Then goals and objectives. You know, I do think there are some differences of opinion on exactly what's a goal and an objective, especially among funders. So use whatever definition they provide, but generally a goal is what you ultimately hope to achieve, such as, you know, we provide food for food secure individuals throughout the Tri-County area, whereas an objective is what you think you can achieve with this particular grant. You might say with $10,000, we'll provide daily meals for over 100 individuals over the next year. So you want those objectives to be what they call SMART objectives. So specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. Happy to go through that again if that's useful, but I do see there's some questions coming in, so I'm going to go through this part relatively quickly. Evaluation plan, I'll just say that's not always required, but it's a good thing to think about if the organization that you work with or will potentially work with doesn't have one. It's something that I, as a grant writer, would ask for right away and try to figure out, because many funders do require that kind of plan. Conclusion is short and sweet, for sure, but make sure that you're including the funder. So something like, you know, we can do this work together with your grant of $10,000. And then budget, just briefly, is just really a line-by-line projection of what you'll need to spend to accomplish your objectives. And I just wanted to put that in there because sometimes people forget that grant writing includes some budgeting. Hopefully there is a finance person at whatever organization you're working with who actually prepares the budget itself. But as a grant writer, you're often expected to make sure that the budget that you have as an organization is something that fits into the format that the funder is asking for. So that is something that's just important to know and to think about. So I'll kind of quickly turn over to the questions. So I think the first question speaks to if you can do grant writing when you're not necessarily part of an organization. Does it make sense to reach out to organizations of interest as a freelancer? So I'm actually a freelancer right now. And have done that work on and off between different full-time positions. I will say for me, I worked full-time as a grant writer first, so that I could establish my experience in the area, and also had enough contacts in the field to be able to, you know, find clients. However, that's not required. I mean, in general, I would say grant writing is something that you could jump right into, and you might already have a lot of the skills needed. It's just proving that to the organization might be challenging if you've never done it before. My recommendation would be, if you can, and if you can afford to do so, to volunteer first so that you can share some sample proposals that you've written, you know, have hopefully a reference from the place that you're volunteering with. Many nonprofits right now, as I said, are struggling for dollars, and there are a lot of foundations and as well as, you know, government entities that are trying to step in to help essentially save some of these small nonprofits. And so volunteering would be extremely important to many of these organizations, and I think they would look very favorably on it. I think it would be more challenging to get a paid position right off the bat without having done, you know, the other kinds of work first. Next question is for a young organization. How do you find and build relationships with funders? Yeah, I mean, I think the person answered the question by looking at the fact that there's a database that I reference in the handout that you can look to for finding funders. But I do appreciate that in this question, Kelly talks about the fact that you need to build relationships. So that's not something that I really touched on a lot, but it is actually one of the most important things when it comes to foundation funders. I think you can write the most beautiful grant proposal, but if it's going to someone who doesn't know you at all, doesn't know your organization, it might not really get a great reception depending on the funder. And the more you can build a relationship first, the better. I have literally built a relationship just by having a technical question about the grant proposal, calling the funder, reaching you know, the grants manager, who isn't even a decision maker on whether or not you get the grant, but they, you know, they heard me asking an intelligent question, meaning I had read the guidelines, I just needed, you know, a little bit more information, and they you know, just knew my name and the organization's name. And so when the grant came in, they put it at the top of the pile. They, you know, kind of maybe said something to their boss, and you know, I have actually, as it can be as simple as that. Now that doesn't always happen, for sure. Often it is the executive director who needs to build those relationships depending on the funder. But if you have a question, if the funder's open to you asking, they don't say on their website, please don't call us. Always call, always try to build a relationship. Go to fundraising events where funders might be. Anything you can do to get a little bit closer to the funder is going to be important, especially for a young organization that's new. So I'm just going to keep going through. I think we only have a few more minutes, but I'm happy to keep going for anybody who wants to, you know, keep hearing answers. Is that okay, Jason? Or
Yeah, we're scheduled until 2, so
okay,
you know,
great.
kind of whatever works for you and what works for other people.
Okay.
Certainly, so we can
Okay.
keep going from there. Looks like is the next question. What's the biggest piece of advice you have when writing an LOI?
I don't know if I can pick just one top piece, but I will talk a little bit about LOIs. So for anybody who doesn't know, letter of inquiry, in many cases, funders will ask for an LOI before asking for a proposal. And in some ways it's their, you know, I guess, gift to us as fundraisers, because they want us to spend a little less time on a full proposal when they don't yet know us and don't yet know if there's a fit. You know, what you're trying to do with an LOI is to make sure there is a fit. And I think being brief, obviously, being clear is important. Even with an LOI, I have sometimes called the funder in advance to say, you know, I think based on your guidelines that we're a fit, but there's one piece of it that I'm not sure about. You know, you fund youth organizing work. We have one program that works with youth, but most of our programs are with adults. Would you consider funding us for just that program? Something like that, where it's a very specific question. And sometimes they'll appreciate getting the chance to talk to you even before reading your letter of inquiry. And sometimes it'll mean that you're able to tailor that very brief, usually maximum of 2 pages letter to exactly what they're looking for. You know, I think it's a condensed version of what you want to put in a proposal. But again, the most important thing is talking about the fit with the funder, because that's what they're looking for. So maybe if there is one, you know, biggest piece of advice, it's try not to get mired in the program details and thinking that you have to describe everything about the program, because you're going to have the opportunity to do that in a full proposal if you're invited to share one, but you're definitely not going to get to share one if it's not clear that you're a good fit for the funder's interests. So yeah, that might be the top tip. It seems like the next question, I think, Jason, you answered. The SMART goals, right?
Did I get it right? Specific,
Yes.
measurable, achievable,
Yep.
relevant, time bound. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. You know, it's some funders will actually specifically ask for that, but most of the time it's sort of unspoken. But it's good to keep in mind, especially because, you know, again, program staff, depending on the organization, are often busy doing the work and they know the program works. And so taking the time to sit down and make it clear what the goals are and why you're achieving them, and how you're achieving them, that sometimes falls to the grant writer to make clear, even though of course you are only ever doing that in consultation with program staff. One of the things that you always want to be careful of is that the deliverables, the things that you're promising the funder you will achieve, that those are things that your program team agrees to achieve. You don't want a grant proposal, but you don't want to win a $50,000 grant that says you're going to, you know, feed 5,000 people, and the program staff says that's, you know, we only have, you know, 100 people that we're going to feed, something like that. You know, that's definitely something you want to avoid. So yeah, but those are the correct words for the acronym. NEH funding, I think, was the next. National Endowment for the Humanities. I have done, I've only ever done one NEH application many years ago. At that time, it was, you know, the sort of sticking point for a lot of the organizations that I've worked with, and the reason that I haven't done a lot of them is that it was really, you had to have someone with a PhD, I believe, that was sort of leading the project. I don't know if that's true anymore. I think, I don't know if I have any great tips on that, except to say for government proposals in general, it does typically take a slightly different form from like a foundation proposal. You definitely want to tell the story to some extent still of what you're doing, but often statistics are much more important. So how many people you're reaching is going to be key. Geography is going to be key. Things along those lines. So I've done NEA, National Endowment for the Arts, and many times. And that, I will say, you know, the good thing is it's often shorter than kind of a lot of other government grants that are much more technical. And I'm not sure if NEH falls into that category or not. But you know, it's just being very detail oriented, even more than a foundation grant. You have to answer the question exactly as asked. But the good thing is government, the staff at these government offices that are screening and awarding these grants, they see you as a fundraiser as their client, essentially. That they serve you. Whereas at a foundation, generally staff at a foundation see that you as a fundraiser are serving them, offering them information, if that makes sense. So if you call NEH, someone will respond. Someone will answer the phone, and someone will get back to you, in a way that is not true necessarily, depending on the foundation, with a private foundation. So I guess maybe that's a tip, is just call with anything. In that case, really, it can be kind of any question you have, even if it's technical about the website, definitely feel free to ask. Okay, so then I think the next one is building relationships with government funding organizations. I think if you're thinking about the federal level, it's a little trickier. Again, call. On the local level, pretty much across the board, although not always. At least it's true in New York. There will be meetings. There will be usually even before sometimes they issue an RFP or request for proposals. They might have gatherings to see what the community thinks the proposal should be about, what the community thinks funding should be for. There will be opportunities to provide feedback, usually online about that, sometimes in person. And then a lot of times there will also be an in-person meeting or meetings once there's an RFP issued, where you can actually go and talk to the people who are, working on from the government side. It depends on the funder and the level. I mean, your geographic area, the level. New York is different from Boston, which is different from a more rural area. So it definitely depends, but often there's a way to meet in person, which, I mean, obviously again is not happening right now, but in the future would be a way to build relationships. Any sort of website or database where one could find organizations looking for volunteer grant writers. I don't know of any. I can definitely, if I think of anything, I can share it with Jason later on. There is one of the resources that I put in the sheet is the blog Nonprofit AF, and there's a Facebook group that's associated with that called Nonprofit Happy Hour, which I definitely recommend joining. It's just a group of nonprofit employees, and there definitely are people who will write questions like that. Does anybody need a volunteer grant writer or something like that? I also would say, if there are causes you're passionate about, find the organizations that are doing that work and reach out to them. Volunteering, I will say, does sometimes cause, like, there are rules around volunteering and what organizations can and can't accept, and so I'm not necessarily equipped to speak to all of that. I know that in some cases, if you're considered an intern, obviously you need to have some payment. So, usually organizations themselves will know what they can and can't accept. But yeah, I don't know of any full website that's dedicated to that. But if I see one, I'll definitely let you know.
So I see there's a couple more questions in the chat, but also Laura, I see you raising your hand. Do you want to jump in with your question, and then we can get back to the chat ones?
Yeah, I apologize. I don't know how to write something in a chat from my phone. That's why I'm asking, I'm verbalizing. So Aimee, you suggested, if you're going to volunteer, to present a sample of a proposal that you've written. how would you do that? How would you go about creating a sample to present if you wanted to start out by volunteering?
So I'm sorry, I think I wasn't clear. I sort of meant the reverse of that, that if you volunteer, then you will hopefully have a sample that you could use if you're looking for paid work. But it is true that there might be an interest in having some sort of writing sample from you as a prospective volunteer. And so I would say, you know, it doesn't have to be a grant proposal. If someone's asking you for a writing sample, I do think something you've written at school could work. I think things that are important to keep in mind, obviously, all the things that you would think of in terms of a well-written paper, you want to have something that's you know, kind of your best work in that sense. But also keep in mind some of the things that I said around, you know, you don't necessarily want something that's just the most beautifully written thing, but rather something that is clear and concise. So if you have something, you know, that was written for maybe more of a research context than a class in literature, would probably be a bit of a better fit. Yeah, I think usually thinking back to my own time volunteering and when I've also worked with volunteers, I think people will accept that if you're right out of school or still in school, that you might not have an actual grant proposal, and that's fine.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'll pop back onto the chat. And it looks like Audrey is saying they're expected to fundraise in about 2 weeks. Yeah. So, you know, and that it's a little tricky given the state of the country, the protests in the wake of George Floyd's murder. I think that you know, it is tricky, and I've actually seen a lot of missteps already in terms of people fundraising as if they are solving the problem of systemic racism with their work, when I don't necessarily think that is their role as an organization. And so I think being clear about where you are as an organization or a program or a project in the work and in the world right now. If your work does address in any way the issues that the country is facing right now, it is important to be clear about that. So I work, for example, with an organization that has a program teaching young men of color how to code. And on first glance, maybe that doesn't seem like the most important program right now compared to some, you know, programs that are working with, you know, people who need food, or Black Lives Matter, as an example. But I do think, you know, one of the things that I said to them is that, you know what, and they're based in New York City. New York City, all summer youth programs were canceled. So this is a program that young men can do online. So they can actually, you know, have a summer program in a world where there aren't any other options for summer activities and summer programs that would help them advance in education and career. So I do think it, you know, I felt like it was important for them to still share that, even though there are other things that are pressing. I will also say that some organizations are choosing, and I think it might be something to consider, to just wait, and, you know that it might not be your time to fundraise. And other organizations are partnering with groups that are doing work that is most relevant to different different aspects of what's happening in our country. So you know, there are organizations that are more well resourced and that have connections with donors, and those donors who will feel more comfortable giving to them than to, say, a smaller grassroots organization. Partnering with that small grassroots organization and doing fundraising together in a way that to that organization feels valuable can also be another way to kind of engage even in more challenging times. You know, so if you can hit on a connection, great. If there really is no connection, can you hook up with another organization for which there is one? And then, yeah, if none of that is true for you, if you may just not be the right moment. And that might be a hard thing to navigate if you're a new fundraiser, and you know, you may not have the ability to make that call, but hopefully whoever you're working with, supervisor, is open to having a realistic conversation about expectations and goals, because I think unfortunately, you know, that is something that sometimes as the fundraiser, you know, reporting up to an executive director, say, you know, you have to be the one to voice some of those concerns and make it clear that, you know, no, you can't just, you know, call up Oprah tomorrow and get $1 million. That, you know, we have to be realistic. So we are at 2 o'clock, but if it's okay, I'll just quickly answer the very last question. And so what is the difference between federal grants and private grant writing? So federal grants, meaning government grants, are coming from the federal level. Little tip there is something called the Federal Register, which you can sign up to get, which tells you all the grants that are coming from the federal level. I don't know how much action there is there right now, probably not a great resource, but at some point it may be. And private grant writing, meaning foundations that are not government related. So a wealthy individual, wealthy family, wealthy corporation created a foundation entity, which is essentially a tax structure, means that the money that they put into that foundation has to be given for charitable purpose. But they're not beholden to any constituency, anything other than giving to a 501c3 organization, which again is a tax designation by the government. So, you know, I would say the difference in terms of the type of writing you would do is government grants of any kind are, you know, as I sort of mentioned before, are going to be a lot more detail oriented, a lot more about the data, and grant writing for private family foundations, especially, going to be more about the story you tell, and you can tell actual stories about clients and things like that. I think that's it.
That's all the questions. Yeah, and I see we're just kind of past time here, so I want to be mindful of your time, Aimee, and everyone else too. So let me just say this to everybody, all students and recent grads who tuned in. Thank you for tuning in very much. And as a staff member at Smith, we miss you greatly. We look forward to getting back on campus, of course, as soon as we can. And a huge thank you to you, Aimee, for sharing your time and sharing your expertise. I don't know, any sort of final thoughts, kind of parting words of wisdom as we wind down for today?
Well, thank you all. I really appreciate it. And I'm excited that there are a lot of people that are excited about fundraising, because I really do think that it's an important part of the work that we need to do moving forward, to kind of rebuild a lot of what's challenging in our country right now. So thank you. And I really do mean it. Feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer questions that way as well.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you again. Thank you, everybody. I wish you all a great day and a great week. Okay. Take care.